World Geography 110, Lecture 1, Part 4. We're looking at demography and urbanization. So there's an uneven distribution of the world's population. The current population is around 7 billion globally, but if you look at the areas, very heavy population, heavier population here, certain parts of Africa, Europe, very lightly populated in this region. So distribution is very uneven. One of the things is along rivers and along the ocean, where there tends to be more water, which is a key factor with population. You can kind of see Mexico City there, New York, and the Pacific seaboard there. Megacities, the demography and urbanization continued. The development of megacities is a big factor. There are these huge cities. You can see where their population currently is, where they expect it to grow to, or where it was in 1950, where it was in 1950, where it is in 2000, and where it's expected to be in 2015. These cities are really huge, very big populations, very big impact. Part of this has to do with rural to urban migration. Part of it is where the jobs are. Some of it could be birth rates, death rates. These are the two factors that impact demography. If you look over here, these are population pyramids. When you look at these two populations, this is a very young population, has a very even birth and death rate. In other words, has a high death rate, has a high birth rate. This is a population that is aging. And this kind of looks like the U.S. A little bit here, and there's your baby boomers. And this is your second round of the baby boomers' children. But basically, as this population moves up here, there's a lot of people down here working to support these people. These people in this group here have to support these and this group. This group right here is currently supporting this smaller young population and this smaller old population. But as these bulges here move up that pyramid, more and more of those people are going to be supported by fewer and fewer people. And that's where real problems come in. In Europe, that is a significant issue. Demographic transition. So modeling of demographic change. This predicts patterns. Demographic transition theory predicts patterns of change over time. And it's impacted by women's status and their fertility rate. So the first thing that usually happens is the death rate drops. And then eventually the birth rate will start to drop also. And the population at that point, you have pre-industrial, transitional, second phase of transition, then the industrial and the post-industrial. And that's where the population as a whole is dropping. What's going on in Europe is in this phase. We are still in this phase. Our population is still growing a little bit. European population is actually dropping if you take out immigrants. Future geographies. So is the population going to boom or bust? Regional decreases, regional increases. This is where the population's dropping. This is where the population's increasing. Emerging resource regions. So resources more than ever are being globalized. There are new demands from developing countries such as China and India to buy up resources, to control resources. because controlling resources controls their manufacturing, and China is a manufacturing and export driven economy. So they need to control lots of resources. They consume a lot of resources. New resource regions. One of the things there was a lot of talk about, um, and there's a lot going on now in developing oil reserves in the U.S. in this region. This region up here has a lot of shale, and they were fracking, which is an expensive process, but they're developing new technologies all the time to make it more efficient, less expensive, and more economical. Um, if oil prices climb at all, that becomes economical again, and the U.S. becomes a large exporter of oil and could upset the balance, particularly for countries in this region. Economic globalization and the challenges to regional governance. Supranational organizations, which I mentioned earlier, NAFTA, EU, WTO, UN, all those types of organizations, those are supranational organizations. They may or may not be elected. Most cases, representatives on these are not elected. The EU, they do have elected representatives. NAFTA, our Congress represents, but there are regulations that govern U.S. policy that we may not have control over. WTO has control over both these. Goal of creating global trading areas. That's the neoliberal approach. That's what you're hearing about. One of the conflicts between in this presidential election is about how the U.S. is going to react in the global markets. States and cities are increasingly making connections with supranational organizations. What that means is these organizations are increasingly taking control of flows of merchandise and governing, setting the rules by which this merchandise and commerce is going to flow, whether it is the flow of ideas or whether it is the flow of money or whether it is the flow of labor. Another big player that a lot of times we don't like to think about, but it is a big deal. New regions of insecurity and crime. We talk about terrorism, but there's also internationalization of crime. So crime syndicates are moving, whether the Mexican cartels operating in the U.S. with connections into the Andean region, into Venezuela and Colombia, Russian and Eastern European cartels, crime cartels all over, Somali pirates. These are all areas of crime that have been internationalized rather than localized in a particular economic arena. Along with globalization, crime has been globalized. Future environmental threats and global sustainability. Multiple threats to the environment. Loss of biodiversity. Extremely important. Every time we lose species, it impacts all other species, and not in a good way in most cases. Water and air pollution. Obviously, big factors. Air pollution from China is killing the forests in the Pacific Northwest. Water pollution has the potential to make all of our water undrinkable. These are big problems that require big solutions and dynamic action. Greenhouse gas emissions. How do you control it? What is its real impact? You have some states that have outlawed talking about global warming, such as Florida. Does it mean that if you don't talk about it, it doesn't exist? I don't think so. Geoengineering. New ideas for how to engineer our world to protect it, such as global reflectors, aerosols sprayed into space to increase the albedo, in other words, the reflectiveness of to keep solar radiation from coming in and heating us up. Carbon storage. I just was reading an article about carbon storage, and they're talking about carbon mining and then storing it down deep underneath the ocean. And that's the end of chapter 1.